Hello, and welcome to Havoc Wargaming, dedicated to bringing you the uncommon. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Ron, and today we're going to do a review of Mad Dogs with Guns by Osprey Games. So let's get started. Mad Dogs with Guns is an Osprey product that came out in 2017 by Howard Whitehouse and Roderick Robertson for tabletop skirmish wargaming set in the Prohibition period in the 1920s and 30s in America. It's based on an earlier book of the same name that was, and I think may still be available on Wargames Vault. Like most of the hardcover Osprey books, it's very professionally done. It looks very good, nice quality, interesting layout. Physically, it's a very good looking product. Some nice, as you may imagine from Osprey, some nice art. There's newspaper clippings from the Paradise Times Dispatch. We'll talk a little bit more about Paradise in a moment. But these are excerpts to help give you some of the flavor and understanding of the period. These will be historic accounts. The book lays out how to play the game and how the rules work. It gives a very large number of excellent examples of gameplay to show how to actually apply the rules. So very useful on that fact. Not a lot of rules in the game, and I don't think the rules for gameplay is necessarily where this game shines. But I'll talk real quick about what these rules are. The characters break down into 6 attributes. There's fists with your close combat skill, gats, which is your shooting, guts, this is your intestinal fortitude is what he says, it's your bravery, it's used for your morale rolls. Stunts, that's done for almost any sort of skill, whether it's jumping from building to building or getting out of the way of a racing vehicle or driving a vehicle for that matter, sort of physical stunts. They say here leaping, diving, dodging, or driving. Smarts is used to solve clues or to determine things that you might see. It's used for charisma, all those things sort of combined. Hits, that's the amount of damage you can take, between 1 and 5 it says here. Then there's a list of skills and personality traits that are chosen, and then weapon, the armament that you're carrying. This is probably the most innovative part of the game. It is a card-driven game, but rather than there being a card that represents each character or a card that represents each side, it's a little more complicated than that. Let's take a standard 2-player game, and this is really intended, I would argue, for 2-player games with a handful, 6 to 10 gangsters on a side. The card deck you will take, in the case of a 2-player game, you would take one of the suits, the red suits, say the hearts. You would take the ace, 2, and the 3, and the joker, king, and queen of the hearts, and stack them into a new deck. You would also include one of the black suits in the same line, and then you would assign those suits to the 2 players. So one side would be hearts and let's say spades for the other side. If you have civilians, you're going to throw a 10 in there as well for each of those suits, and 2 jokers. So the game is activated by pulling these cards, and if it is a face card, a jack, queen, or king, that activates everybody on your side. So everybody can be activated and take 2 actions. Or you can choose to hold the card. That's going to apply with either. We'll talk about holds later. Or if it's a lower card, if it's an ace, aces are considered low. If it's an ace, 2, or 3, those are a single activation. Those will allow you to activate an individual character, though they do mention in the rules that that extends to anybody within 2 inches of that individual character. That was mostly done so that you can operate cars. So you can activate a car that's got a full load of people and just handle it all at one time. But it doesn't actually specify in the rules that they have to be in a car to do that. The 10s that are in the deck, those 10s are in there to activate any civilians. So if the 10 of your suit shows up, you get to choose to move all or some or none of the civilians as you see fit, with some limitations. You can't have them attack your enemy and directly help you in that fashion. They have to act like civilians. Any of these cards, you can choose actually to play them when they come up, or you can hold them. I mentioned earlier that if you play these cards, they give you each of the characters that get to activate 2 actions. If you hold it, you get to use it as an interrupt to interrupt your opponent later. But when you're using it as an interrupt, you lose one of those actions. You only get to use one action when it's an interrupt card. You may have noticed that there's nothing in here about how many times. The turn continues to play until one of the two jokers in the deck shows up. When that joker shows up, that ends the turn. Any held cards go back into the pile and are lost. But you can activate over and over and over, as far as I can tell. The rules don't come right out and tell you that. They don't tell you you can't. They don't tell you you can. But the examples they give make it very clear that there's no limit to how many actions a character can take in his turn. On an activation, he can only take 2 actions, or on 1 action if it's on a hold card. But he can keep, you could use every single card that came up to keep activating the same fellow, same gangster, if you saw fit. Not being clear directly is one of the negative things I will say about these rules. They are really, really loose, and you'll be frustrated by things you wish they would tell you that they don't. I'm going to suggest that you try not to be frustrated. The man who writes this comes from what I can tell, from a role-playing game background, and I think that's part of why the rules are looser than we wargamers might want, is that he's left it a lot for you to make a decision at the time, to keep the narrative flowing, to make it feel real, to keep it enjoyable and keep the pace exciting, and I think that's what he was trying to do. But there's a lot of things that either doesn't tell you how to do, or is hard to find and you have to search around to figure out how to do. So that's a bit of a challenge to the rules. Nowhere in the game, for instance, does it say what size your table should be. Now, I think that's because he doesn't want to restrict you to table size. Some of these adventures are, you might be taking out a rival gang boss in a barber shop, and the barber shop might be the whole table. I played a game with the club with several gangs the other night on a 6x4 table. So I think he's leaving that option open, but there's not much guidance on that. The game is played using D6s, and usually the intention is to roll under the stat. Let's use shooting. If you're shooting, you'll have mods that are based on your range or how fast you may have been moving, or whether there's cover or not. But those mods all affect your stat. In the case of shooting, your GAT score. And they're all pluses or minus to your GAT score, and then a success is just rolling under that GAT score on a D6. Then you roll on a deadly weapon table a certain number of dice. I said D6. That actually depends on what you're firing. D6 is for a pistol, but if you're firing a Tommy gun, it might be shooting 6d6. You roll dice, you get a success for any of the dice that are under your modified stat roll. Melee works similarly. You combine your successes against your enemy's success, so either side can win in a melee fight. And melee has 2 charts you roll on, a brawling chart or a deadly weapon chart, depending on whether you're using a baseball bat or whether you're using a knife. You have a choice of movement speeds, with walking being 4 inches, run is 4 inches plus d6. There's rules for using bombs or throwing dynamite or hand grenades. There's some limited rules for using vehicles. The vehicles are set up on a choice of a few different speeds, taking turns, swerves or curves they call them, or civilians on the road. All these things can create hazards, which you have to roll against your stunts roll, or you could end up losing control of the vehicle. Very, very simple. Again, a little hard to follow how to actually use it. These rules are simple, they're just not thoroughly explained. There's rules for having people writing on the running boards. Another thing I should probably mention, I think this is kind of innovative, is where it talks about forming your gang. They give you 3 different methods: by rolling, just buying off a rack, or by designing them entirely point by point. That's interesting that it gives you 3 different methods to decide upon on your own. Where this game, in my opinion, shines is with its campaign rolls. The campaign is designed to take place in the city they call Paradise. You could put it wherever you want. You could put it in Paradise and follow the descriptions they give. You could put it in Chicago or New York, whatever you wanted to do. There's a clever system of how to run that campaign, and the campaign goal is to take over all the rackets in the town, and how many players you have determines how many rackets you have in the game. So there's rules for buying certain city officials. And so basically, the way the campaign turn works. You receive money from your rackets, you pay the expense of supporting those rackets, you pay for any of the officials you've paid, and then you can use the rest of that money to either purchase new gang members, to purchase vehicles, to make attacks on the uncontrolled rackets, or attack controlled rackets, in which case, well, there's an example of how you end up with a game. Ever two of the gangs are encountering each other in either a raid or an attack. Maybe you're put a hit on somebody else's gang, then those become one of the scenarios. One of the things I really like about the scenarios, particularly if you're playing the campaign game, in the campaign game you're going to want to assign what your people are doing, your gangsters are doing, and some of them you may have put at a racket that you think might be vulnerable. But of course, you're not always going to know what rackets are going to be attacked by the opponent. So the rackets, they all have a certain number of guards based on the amount of money they generate, and those guards will be there automatically if that scenario is played in one of those rackets, if there's actually a raid or an attack on your racket. But there's a reinforcement rule which allows one of those guards, if they're in contact with a phone for a turn, to call reinforcements from your gang list. So there's rules for coming in and helping save that racket. I really think the campaign section is the best part of this book. The game rules are okay. You know, I've played a couple times. It's still fun. If you didn't like the rule system, you could clearly just slip in a whole other system. You know, there's a bunch out there. Pulp Alley with their Vice Alley expansion would work. There's, what is it, Gangland Way? I can't remember what that game is. So a number of different choices you could do that way. These are quick and a lot of fun, I found. A little chaotic, maybe a little movie-based, and the cars tend to explode very easily. So it is a little bit cinematic, perhaps, in its nature. In fact, when I was talking about fighting, hand-to-hand fighting, particularly with baseball bats and things, they can go a long time and it's hard to really do any damage, and you're likely just to knock out your opponent. Not a bad thing in a campaign game where you're going to want to bring them back in later. The guns seem to more likely send you looking for cover and therefore losing later actions than to actually hurt you. But if they do hit, they can kill you very quickly. One of the other aspects of the campaign rules is there's a public outrage score. So you keep track of what the standing is for the public outrage. And if it ever gets too high, then the police are forced to act, and they will come in and try to get order back into the city. And if it gets bad enough, it may not be the police, it may be the feds. So that's kind of a nice addition to the rules too. And it makes you have to think about where you're pulling these things off. Am I shooting somebody down on a crowded street where I'm putting civilians at risk and I'm being very visible? Or is it a nice crime committed in the middle of nowhere? I mentioned that a joker ends your turn. And when that happens, you reshuffle the deck and you start over. What I didn't mention is how the game ends. If ever the first card you pull of a new turn is a joker, police in general are on their way. You hear their sirens in the distance or something like that. You have until the end of that turn to get all of your gangsters off the table. Any gangster that's still on the table, they're all arrested. It doesn't matter a lot for one-off game, but again, in the campaign rules, there's rules for paying off your lawyer and possibly paying off the judge, possibly having your gangster go state's evidence against you. It can go pretty poorly. So that's an interesting aspect. Another aspect of the campaign game that I really like is every gang, except for just street gangs, are expected to have a accountant, which is a pretty clever idea too. And the accountant can also end up going state's evidence against you, which is bad. In the end, I'm enjoying these rules. I do recommend them. As I mentioned, they're frustrating at times, but I think it's best to try to be free with that and just understand that's the system. And if you can't find a rule that you're looking for, don't worry about it. Just decide what makes sense to you. In fact, we've occasionally violated the rules because we didn't like what the rules stated. Cars are disabled very, very easily. And we wanted a case of desperation when a gang boss was dying in the back of the car. We wanted to be able to get him out of there and maybe save his life, even though we had taken damage to the tires, which in the rules make the car inoperable, but we didn't think really would. We just increased the number of hazards he was making. So that's the way I think to look at it. Think of it more like a role-playing game. Think about having a little freedom with it. I think it may work best because of that with a GM, unless you have players that really work well together and think what's best for the game result. This is much better suited for those kind of players and for a gentlemanly club game than a game at a convention might be. But if you're interested in doing this period at all, I recommend this book, if only to take the campaign rules. But go ahead and give the rules a try as well. Like I said, I'm enjoying them. I feel like I may be coming off very negative on the rules. They are a lot of fun. They're not very detailed. They're pretty quick. They're easy to pick up. They make for a pretty fast game. And so maybe a little beard and pretzel-y and cinematic, but still, I mean, it's a gangster game. What do you want? So give it a try. Give it a look. I don't know how popular it's been. I noticed there aren't a lot of videos on the game. I'm going to have a video up here pretty soon. As I mentioned, I've played the game so far 3 times. We are, in my club, playing, or about to start a campaign of the game, but I played 3 one-off games. 2 of those were simple 2-player, well, one was actually solo, but two gangster games playing each other. And then the third was a multiplayer game with 5 different gangs, 2 of which were the police. In the campaign game, nobody plays the police. Look forward to seeing that video here. I hope you are looking forward to it. I'm certainly looking forward to putting it up. If you have any questions about Mad Dogs with Guns, or if you've played it and have your own experiences you'd like to share, please put those in the notes down below. Also, if you have any idea for further content you'd like to see presented here on Cry Havoc Wargaming, we look for that in the comment section down below as well. If you've enjoyed this video or found it all useful, I hope that you'll hit like. And if you'd like to receive further notifications for videos like this one that might help you better determine how to spend your money or time in your wargaming hobby, then please hit subscribe and ring our notification bell. Till next time, cheers.